Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at a very interesting book that focuses on an organization that touches our lives every day. Often we don't realize that the United Nations provides basic services to us. But today we're going to talk about some of those services, and my guest is an expert on the United Nations. My guest is Mr. Ian Williams. Mr. Ian Williams wrote UNtold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and war. He has been a UN correspondent for numerous international media outlets and a contributor to The Guardian since 1989. Ian Williams, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Good to be here, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into your very interesting book. Let me just show it right now. And I can see if I can do this without covering the title and your name and everything. And the title of it.
The name's important.
It is. UNtold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and war. And the untold part, it's capital U, capital N, T-O-L-D, UNtold.
Yes.
But again, welcome. And let's focus on this book. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I did a book back for the 70th anniversary of the UN, called the UN for Beginners. Loads of things had happened since then. And in fact, I lent that book to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General. Well, I didn't lend it to him, I presented it to him. They were all out of print. I had to buy a second-hand copy of my own book to give him. And I met him a few weeks later. He said, that book's really good. You must bring it up to date and do a new version. So this is more than an up-to-date, an updating. Now, there's a lot more in here. And one of the things that I realized as I was rewriting this is just how much things have changed and how much that was hot on everyone's lips. I mean, at the time I wrote the first book for the 50th anniversary of the UN, issues like Iraq were on everyone's lips, you know, so were the Balkans, was only just beginning to warm up, really. There are loads of other issues. And since then, there are so many issues that have come to the fore and eclipsed that. I mean, basically, I'd have to go back and explain the history of whole regions to try and tell modern young readers especially what we're talking about.
Exactly. And the UN, as you mentioned, it's so complex today. When we think of 1945, the UN rose out of the ashes, really, of World War II. It dealt with, the major goal was to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights. And issues like climate change, Ebola, they weren't talking about that. The UN was not involved in helping to move aircraft, ships, mail, and weather information safely around the globe. It's doing that today. How do you take a very complex organization with really a small staff? If you look at it, 50,000 staff, or not including some of the agencies, but around the world, and explain the who, what, why, where, when, and how of this very complex organization.
Well, the first thing is you have to understand. You have to have a vision.
Grasp of it.
Yes, you have to have a vision of the organization yourself. And I realized that the UN was important, not so much as an organization doing things, but as a catalyst that allowed other people to do things around which countries could organize, and countries and people who would never otherwise have got together to decide to do things like the International Space Treaty or the International Treaty on the Law of the Sea. You know, incredibly complex things that only a structure like the UN could get it. I mean, you remember John Bolton, the temporary UN ambassador appointed by George Bush, who hated the organization. He said it should be closed off above the 10th floor because it was useless. And I used to counter-quip that actually it should be closed above the 4th floor because that's as far as the tourists could get. And what was really important was the UN as a symbol, because it often made a mess when it tried to do things. But the fact that it was there allowed people to appeal to the charter. It allowed people to appeal to the international courts. It allowed people to actually do things and have aspirations and to fight for them. And that's the angle that I've really concentrated on, the fact that the UN is this enabling catalyst. It's a symbol to a lot of people. You can see when they come into the visitors off here, they stroke the statues. You know, they go and stroke the twisted up pistol outside. This is, you know, this is seriously symbolic, and they stand in awe as they stand on the plaza outside. It stands for something, and that's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, some presidents, every president has had difficulties at times with the UN, no doubt about it, but some have been outright hostile to the United Nations. But as you look back over all of the presidents who've been involved with the U.S. presidents involved with the United Nations since 1945, even some of them have had complaints about the UN, but not one has recommended pulling out of the United Nations. And many observers say that's because the United States benefits more than any other country, because what we were talking about earlier, moving aircraft, ships, mail, weather, information around the world, 15 peacekeeping missions in very volatile areas of the world. But the U.S. is one of the biggest beneficiaries, is it not?
Well, it's indisputable. I mean, the U.S. is the world's policeman, whether it likes it. Well, it does like it most of the time, and whether other people like it or not. It's the global superpower, and it's the UN that's the legitimizing agent. And when U.S. presidents don't like the UN, it's because it doesn't do what he wants. That's been the pattern all along. If you remember, when President Bush invaded Iraq along with Tony Blair, they kept trying to invoke the UN. Even then, they tried to invoke a UN resolution that nobody else considered applied, but they still tried to. They still need this vestige of legitimacy. And then, of course, they tried, pathetically, if you remember, to get the coalition of the willing, which was the coalition of the ignorant. They were signing up countries that didn't know they'd been signed up and causing riots in capitals.
Coalition.
Yes. They mixed up Slovenia and Slovakia. I mean, this is the United Nations. They're called the United Nations. They go, no, Slovenia is different, and Slovakia is further north.
Totally separate.
And neither of them really want to be involved in this enterprise with you. Thank you very much. So, I mean, that legitimizing thing, which Kofi Annan referred to, is extremely important. And we've seen it recently with the issue about Jerusalem. I mean, until the UN says differently, Jerusalem is not part of any country. It's a corpus separatum. That's what the resolution said back in 1948, the resolution 181. That the partition resolution said Jerusalem was separate. And that's why until now no country, well, some countries did, they were bribed, but some countries, no country puts an embassy there because it isn't. And if you think of some of the other anomalies as well, I remember arguing with Ali Alatas, the foreign minister of Indonesia, about East Timor, which the Indonesians had occupied. And he said, well, everyone's forgotten. I said, no, as long as the UN resolution on the books is telling you to get out, no one is going to give you a clear title to that half the island, East Timor. And of course, that's exactly what happened. You know, East Timor is now independent. No one recognizes Morocco's claim to Western Sahara. And, you know, they're not going to do anything about it, but no one recognizes the title. And this gets incredibly important. Countries like Indonesia and Morocco and Israel spend a fortune lobbying across the world to try to get the title, and they can't because the UN as a collective body stands in the way. It's not some bureaucrat refusing to stamp the paper. It's the collectivity of the global the global community.
And it is a collection. It is 193 countries are part of the General Assembly. It's a voluntary association of governments to a large degree, and they're here to focus on these international problems. And in many cases, they're very successful. Others are not quite as successful. You mentioned Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon was 8th, and now Antonio Guterres is 9th. The Secretary General is basically the CEO, for want of a better title, we'll just say it's sort of the CEO. Trygve, when he was going out of office, said to Dag Hammarskjöld, the 2nd Secretary General, that being Secretary General is the most difficult job in the world. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, especially for him it was, because remember the Russians had refused to recognize him for 2 years, refused to even turn up when he was in the chair.
Tough to do your job.
Yes, and nobody could work out a way to get around it. And Dag Hammarskjöld immediately found the same thing. I mean, you know, Dag Hammarskjöld, the suggestion is he paid the supreme price because he upset some of the powers over Central Africa. He died in an alleged plane crash, which looks more and more suspicious all the time. Boutros-Ghali paid a price for being independent-minded as well, you know. So there's a track record, and it is one of the things that really needs to be emphasized is the degree of independence for the Secretary General. He should get a lot of support to give him the independence and the principles to turn around and say no to the great powers, and especially one particular great power, of course. I mean, the Russians and the Americans are the only ones who have functionally fired a Secretary General. The Russians with Trygve and the Americans with Boutros-Ghali. And that was under a democratic president who allegedly was in total support of the UN. And yet, you know, I have my own suspicions about why that happened, which was to do with internal American politics. Because, you know, Boutros-Ghali was far from anti-American. I had lots of conversations with him, and he said, you know, the they are almost as indispensable as they think they are, was his line. But we shouldn't give way to them all the time. He said, you warn friends when they're running off the edge of a cliff.
It's very important. Well, the UN was founded in 1945 on 3 basic principles. One was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. No easy task, very difficult to do. The UN does it in a variety of ways. One is with the peacekeeping missions. Right now, there are 15 peacekeeping missions. How has that played into helping to eliminate that scourge of war? And what can the UN do to focus on other areas where there may be conflict or potential conflict?
It's been a perennial subject for study in the UN system, the Agenda for Peace from Boutros-Ghali, because of course peacekeeping isn't mentioned in the UN Charter at all. Right. It's not in the official structure. It's something that proves that the UN is resilient. It's a bit like the British Constitution. It just grows like Topsy, So you've got peacekeeping, you've got all these other functions in there which aren't actually mentioned. And the body that's actually supposed, and this is one of the factoids in the book, that is supposed to do all of this is the Military Staff Joint Committee, which I'm presuming has been meeting in the basement of the UN every 2 weeks since 1945. And to the best of our knowledge, this committee, which has the officers from the 5 major powers in there, it's supposed to wield combined fleets, air force and army to stomp out on newcomers who start wars. It has not met functionally for all of those years. I mean, I think the only argument they have is who pays for the coffee. That's the biggest decision. But it still meets in a ritual way. But the real work is being done up in peacekeeping. But so we've grown around the institutional sort of fossilization to build a new structure. But that structure isn't totally responsible, because the way it's affected, who is in charge of the peacekeepers? And as we know, the individual countries are. They're on a sort of contract basis. It's almost a franchise. And we've seen, like, the Rwandans are claiming that there's evidence that the French so-called peacekeepers in Rwanda were complicit in the genocide, which I think in my book I said they were. So I didn't wait for the latest Commission of Inquiry. That they went in under a fig leaf to protect the people who were doing the genocide, because they were French-speaking genocidaires, so that was okay. The others, we've seen the sexual assault and the rape in the peacekeeping. And it's very difficult for the UN to do anything about it, because it doesn't have direct disciplinary authority over the troops. It has to go to the countries concerned. And the countries concerned will not send troops. They're not going to send troops to the Congo if they think the Congolese courts will get hold of them. Because, that must be one of the worst fates in the world, to have a Congolese court sitting on your case, innocent or guilty. So no one would send peacekeepers if they thought they'd be under local jurisdiction. And then some of the troops, always desperate for troops. I mean, in the case of Cambodia, at one point, they sent a penal battalion from Bulgaria, which sort of raped, looted and pillaged its way through Cambodia, and no one could do anything about it. I know for the Bulgarians at the time, it was great. They got money from the UN for getting rid of some of their worst people.
Exactly.
It was bad for the Cambodians.
Exactly. The UN has changed on this quite a bit. They now have a zero tolerance policy against any peacekeeper who violates any of the laws, the rules, the regulations, military code of ethics, and they are changing that to a large degree. And of course, it's evolved over the years, and today, the peacekeeping of today is considerably different from 1948 with the first peacekeeping operation. But you're absolutely right. And one myth about the UN is that the UN has a large standing army, which it does not. It has no troops whatsoever. These 110,000 troops right now in 15 different peacekeeping missions are on loan. They're borrowed from other countries. But let's take a break here just for a moment. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and look at some of our previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a community access television station, PBS station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, please feel free to download our programs. Just go to the website. Global Connections is provided free of charge as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at the only a real international institution as far as the one that brings all of the 193 countries of the world together, and that is the United Nations. And my guest today is an expert on the UN. He's covered the UN and he's written books on the UN. My guest today is Mr. Ian Williams. Ian, you've been involved with the United Nations for many, many years now, and you've talked to the key celebrities here, you've talked to the personalities, you've looked at the issues, you've gotten behind the scenes briefings, and it's just amazing. Your book is, I like it for many reasons, because you give unique insights into a lot of issues, but also this is a complex topic, and you kind of break it down and make it understandable. So people should take a look at this.
And make it humorous as
and
well.
Humorous, true, right? Which sometimes can be even more challenging. Yeah. Well, let's look at the second part of the UN, the human rights part. That was one of the 3 goals, to enhance human rights. How has the UN been able to do that? Through the Human Rights Council, through the International Criminal Court, responsibility to protect things, different programs and institutions within the UN, sub-institutions, or some outside, like the ICC. But how have they been able to do that?
With some difficulty. I mean, first of all, there's been a lot of challenges over the years to the fact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that people allege it's Western and not universal. It was. I mean, I've reinforced it. I went back to the records. It was a universal declaration. There was a Chinese delegate, there was an Arab delegate, there was an Indian freedom fighter in there, there was a British trade unionist, the leader of the Trade Union Congress. We're all involved in the drafting of this. It's been subsumed under Eleanor Roosevelt and a few others who hogged the highlights about it all. But it was a genuine attempt at a universal declaration. Mm-hmm. And I think the most distressing thing was that at the time of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, there was a group of NGOs, diplomats, and journalists who've been involved in human rights issues met here in the UN. And we had a sort of colloquy about what could we do to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm sad to say, for once, there was complete unanimity. On no account should we try to revise it, because any current version would be much worse than what we got in 1948. There'd be so many special exceptions, except for Confucian principles, except for alleged Muslim principles, except for, alleged Catholic principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would come with more small print than a telephone directory. Do you remember telephone directories?
Oh, yes. Still have a few.
Yeah. So, I mean, this would be... that was accepted, but the fact it's still there and people swear by it is good. The issue comes down on the Human Rights Council. You might remember, first of all, the Human Rights Commissioner has more authority than he used to, and certainly since Ciego de Mello and others enhanced the position. And I have to say, the Hashemites are not my favourite royal family. I'm not a royalist, but Prince Ziyad of the current commissioner, I think, is doing a very strong job, and he's really put some bark into the organisation, which is why he gets vilified quite often by people. But the Human Rights Council itself is very disappointing, and it's because of one of the worst things about the UN, which I call the Buggins turn principle, is that countries are basically, you can go and you can get a book from the New Zealand embassy, the New Zealand mission, which lays out who has been agreed to be elected to these positions for decades ahead. There's a rota basis for the Security Council, for others, and especially in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, they have a rota basis. And this means that countries that are manifestly unsuited to be on there will end up on the Human Rights Council. Now, you'd think the very least qualification to be on the Human Rights Council would be that you sort of gave women the vote, you didn't amputate, you didn't behead, you didn't occupy and oppress. None of that has ever worried anybody. You'd think to be on the Security Council, basic qualification would be you wouldn't be in defiance of Security Council's resolutions telling you to quit occupied territories. No problem. Yeah. They get on there on this rota basis. And when the council was reformed, was it 10 years ago? There was a serious attempt to actually open it up and put transparency. And at the time, it almost worked because it was a different era in the South Africa. It was the era of the great leaders, Mandela, the people from down there. And they were looking forward. NAPAD, new economic policy for African development, all of that. And they were serious about it. But since then, it's relapsed into a sort of Buggins' turn for kleptocracies and bureaucracies to get people on regardless. And I think that's really, really hampered it. And the US, of course, doesn't help because it should be a paragon of human rights. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who was one of the major movers. But instead, the US castigates those countries it doesn't like for human rights issues and praises others with far worse records. You needn't be a fan of the Iranians to say, well, but they have votes, women have the vote, women are allowed to drive. There's a little Arab kingdom just the opposite side of the Gulf that has none of these and is US's closest ally, and the US never denounces its human rights record. I mean, that sort of sums it up. Cuba is boycotted and sanctioned for human rights, and by the way, there are serious human rights issues in Cuba. But Honduras, oh no, they're our friends, that's fine. They can rig as many elections as they like, they can massacre villages, no problem. Because, I'm not sure I can say it on the air, but they are sons of, but they're our sons of, as Franklin Roosevelt said, by the way.
That's right, I remember you said that, yes. I don't remember him saying it that day, but I've read about it. As you look at the UN, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I can't believe we're about out of time, but as you look at the UN today, what's one thing, I think we'd only get through one thing, that the UN can do to be more efficient, more effective, and more relevant than what it's been over the past 72 years?
I think it's often been inhibited from rallying a public constituency because it's scared of alienating member states. And when you've got a bold and forthright leadership, they can go over the heads of the politicians and they can rally people. It's one of the reasons why Kofi Annan had the perfect operation. He had loudmouthed sort of second-rank people who were allowed to shoot their mouth off. If they went too far, he'd disavow them. But if the countries came to him, he could say, "Oh no, that's Mark. You know what he's like. And he can get away with it." And this could rally support for international causes, and in a very judicious way, without rattling the teeth, without rattling the boat too much, you could rally it. And we do live in democracies. I think one of the problems is countries like Britain and America and France and others don't know what their representatives are doing in the United Nations. They don't know what they're voting for and what they aren't. And these should be matters of big public debate. Like when Britain put forward a candidate for judge for the International Court, who was somebody who had sort of koshered or halaled the Iraq war for Tony Blair. People should have raised questions about that. Is this really the type of judge we want to submit? Is it good for Britain? Is it good for the world? Is it good for the court? And in fact, he's just basically lost the last election. He stood down. I'm not quite sure whether the person who replaced him was any better, but that should have been a matter for public debate in Britain and other parts. And the other judges. These are international figures, and the UN needs more scrutiny, and critical scrutiny as well. People need to look at it, and instead of just blindly following down the foxhole, as it were, with the Murdoch media, it should be looking at things and say, this is seriously wrong, and our government should be part of the solution.
Exactly. And the UN does impact our lives every day, and it's not that it's intruding into our lives, it's providing basic services, as I said at the beginning, to help move mail, weather information, to help us travel safely in international airspace, or if we take a cruise in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean or wherever it may be, to make sure those ships are safe, they don't crash into each other, and pirates don't board the ships. But with your new book, Untold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and war, you've taken a very complex institution that's not perfect, far from it, but it is indispensable, as Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, said, and has been an organization that's gotten more, I think, more important over the years. It's much more important today than it was in 1945, in my opinion. But Ian Williams, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Good to be with you. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.